In 1696, Scotland found itself dealing with a terrible calamity, an epidemic of witches. The devil had weaseled his way into the community of Renfrewshire, corrupting young and old alike. You see, behind every witch was a pact with the devil. Hiding in plain sight, these witches were to be feared, a force to be reckoned with. They could curse you with just a few words, or even a simple stare. The witches turned their gaze onto a young girl who'd made the mistake of crossing them, and they would have her soul by any means necessary. The young girl made her tormentors known, eventually pointing the finger at dozens of people, men, women, and even children. Her accusation sparked one of the worst witch hunts in Scottish history. Families turned against each other. There were accusations of supernatural murder. The devil himself made an appearance, and to top it all off, there was even a bewitched eggshell.
Ooh, I love a bewitched object.
Oh, I know you do. That's why I mentioned it. This is the true story of the witches of Renfrewshire. Our story takes us to Renfrewshire in Scotland. It is beautiful. It's a tranquil looking area, filled with greenery and a number of sparkling rivers. But appearances are often deceiving. The year is 1696 and tensions were running high all over Scotland. There was famine, widespread poverty, the threat of a French invasion, and according to the church, Satan was running riot. Everyone was on edge. Now, the first character that I need to introduce you to is Catherine Campbell, described as a young, well-favoured lass in her early 20s by some accounts, or a young woman of a proud and revengeful temper by others. Catherine was from the Highlands, but opportunities there were a little bit lacking, so she packed up the few possessions that she had and moved to Renfrewshire, in the hopes of finding a better future. And she'd found it, or so she thought. By May 1696, she'd gotten a job as a domestic servant to the Shaw family, John, Christine, and their 6 children. Now, her new employers were wealthy and highly regarded in the community. You see, John was the 9th Laird of Bargaran.
Oh, what now?
A laird, someone who owned a large estate in Scotland. In this case, the Bargaran estate. Catherine's new job would have been hard and the pay low, but there were positives to this arrangement. Domestic servants would usually get food, clothing and shelter as part of the deal. May turned into August and Catherine was settling in nicely to the new role, but she perhaps gotten slightly too comfortable. You see, things were a little bit more relaxed where she came from in the Highlands, and soon something that likely seemed perfectly mundane to Catherine would turn her life upside down. On a Monday morning in August, feeling a little bit parched, she snuck a drink of milk from the kitchen, unaware that she was being watched. The Shaw's 11-year-old daughter, Christian, had caught Catherine red-handed and rushed off to tell her mother, Christine, all about the scandalous sight that she'd just seen. Now, Christine was not impressed. This was stealing and completely unacceptable, so she made sure to give Catherine a very good telling off.
Oh, for goodness sake, all this fuss over a drink of milk.
It's about to get even worse. Later that day, Catherine would make a terrible mistake. Angry with Christian for telling on her, she shouted at the girl 3 times, "Let the devil haul your soul through hell." Words that were flippantly said in a fit of anger. Words that Christian and the other servants that were watching would see as a curse. At the back of their minds, the other servants and Christian started to think that maybe Catherine was a witch. I mean, she'd uttered a curse and she'd stolen milk, which was often tampered with milk, stealing it from cows or spoiling it.
How do you steal milk from a cow?
I have absolutely no idea. Magic, clearly. A few uneventful days then passed, but Catherine's words weighed heavily on Christian's mind. On the 21st of August, Christian was playing out in the courtyard with a younger sister when she saw an elderly woman approaching. It was Agnes Naismith, a beggar that was well known in the area. Times were really tough for her and she often came to the Shaw's house, seeking food, clothing, anything to help her survive. Hardened by poverty, she had come to be known as a woman of a malicious disposition, addicted to threatenings. Likely a biased description, mind you. Anyway, she was seen as someone that he didn't want to rub the wrong way. Some were even convinced that she was a witch. Agnes, trying to be friendly, decided to strike up a conversation with Christian. She asked Christian how her mum and the new baby were doing. Her mum had given birth not too long ago, you see. Christian clearly didn't like this question and snapped at Agnes. What do I know? Taken aback, Agnes paused and tried a different tack. She asked Christian how she was doing and how old was she now. Christian replied that she was well and she was 11 now. Agnes then went on her way. The next evening, Christian got all snuggled up in bed and began to drift off to sleep. It wasn't long though before she awoke with a start, overcome with a feeling of dread. Something just didn't feel right. She began to struggle and cried out to her parents for help. They of course rushed into the room to see what the matter was. And then the unbelievable happened. Christian was said to fly over the top of a resting bed where she was lying. She flew with such force, such violence, that if a woman hadn't been standing between her and the door to cushion the blow, she might not have survived the impact. Her parents were shocked and confused. They scooped Christian up and put her back to bed. But something still wasn't right. Her body was stiff and rigid, and she lay there, unmoving, unspeaking, almost like she was dead. Half an hour later, she recovered slightly, only to then be seized by terrible pains throughout her entire body. For days on end, she would suffer from intermittent fits where she couldn't speak. Her body would seize up and contort itself into all kinds of horrifying positions. It was said that she stood like a bow on her feet and her neck at once. By mid-September, things would get even worse for Christian. She was often seen struggling with someone or something that no one else could see, violently thrashing about, trying to defend herself from whatever it was that was attacking her. She fought so ferociously that 4 strong men couldn't restrain her. John and Christine did what any good parents would do. They enlisted the help of a local doctor. Now, this doctor tried everything he could think of, including some good old-fashioned bloodletting. But alas, nothing seemed to help. Christian's body still contorted, even worse than before. Her fits were so violent that they made the bed shake, and her belly was said to rise and fall like a pair of bellows. Soon the identities of the invisible attackers would be revealed to Christian, and I'm sure you'll never guess who they were. Well, surprise, surprise, they were none other than Catherine Campbell, the servant that had cursed her, and Agnes Naismith, the elderly woman she had snapped at. Christian was convinced that they were getting their revenge. She was now able to speak during her fits, and she made sure that the names of her tormentors were known to the world, screaming that the 2 women were attacking her, thrusting swords into her sides. John and Christine were logical people though, so despite what Christian said, they still felt that there must be a medical explanation for their daughter's illness. They took Christian to Glasgow to see a renowned physician called Dr. Matthew Brisbane. If anyone could cure their daughter, it would be him. Dr. Brisbane treated Christian with all kinds of medicines, and his methods, well, they seemed to be working. Over the space of 10 days, she started to get better. John and Christine were so relieved, they decided to take their little girl back home. Christian was doing fabulously. She was symptom-free for a whole 2 weeks. Sadly, it would turn out that this relief was only temporary. Her fits would soon return with a vengeance. Her tongue protruded out of her mouth, all the way down to the bottom of her chin, and her teeth would suddenly clench together. Her parents would have to quickly put something between her teeth to stop her biting her tongue off. John and Christine were at their wits' end. Their daughter was suffering and nothing seemed to be working. They decided to take her back to Dr. Brisbane in Glasgow. He was one of the greatest medical minds. Surely he'd be able to come up with some kind of a cure. On their way there though, Christian's illness would get even more bizarre. She started to retch, and out of her mouth came a lock of hair. Then another, and another. Some were plaited, some were knotted, and to top it off, they were different colours, so they had to have come from different people. By the time they arrived at Dr. Brisbane's, Christian was still vomiting up an amazing variety of hair. And then, to the absolute astonishment of the doctor, Christian started spitting out lumps of coal cinders. Now, these were quite sizable chunks, as big as chestnuts, and They were so hot that they could hardly be touched. Then came straw, pins, bones, sticks, feathers, candle fat, hay mixed with dung. The list goes on. She began to draw quite a crowd, all eager to see what would come out of her mouth next.
This all sounds very familiar. It's almost like these witchcraft cases follow a script.
It does sound familiar, doesn't it? Fits, strange bodily contortions, and vomiting up objects all seem very common where witchcraft is supposedly involved. Throughout all of this, Christian was insistent that Catherine and Agnes were the cause of all of her suffering, and she was often heard reasoning with an invisible Catherine. "Katie, what ails thee at me? I am sure I never did thee wrong. Come, let us agree. Let there be no more difference betwixt us." Dr. Brisbane was at a loss. He could find no natural cause for her symptoms. The coals that came out of her mouth were piping hot, for goodness sake, and there was no one there to secretly feed all these strange objects to her, was there? And the objects were bone dry. You'd expect them to be wet if she'd eaten them. He conceded that perhaps this was indeed witchcraft and he wouldn't be able to help her. Christian was then taken back home. Her fits continued and more tormentors entered the fray, their identities sometimes announced to her by a voice above her head. And soon the devil himself would appear before her. It was said that she saw the devil in prodigious and horrid shapes, threatening to devour her. She would then become stiff, with all the parts of her body distended and stretched out as a corpse. Sometimes she would try and grab at the clothes of her invisible tormentors, and one time she succeeded. "I've got a hold of his sleeve," she cried out. There was a ripping noise as she grasped and pulled at the air. When she opened her hand, inside her palm was a piece of torn red cloth. Christian's parents had tried the medical route and that didn't work, so they turned to the local church for help. The church elders had never heard of such a terrible case of witchcraft before. They would pray for Christian. They arranged for the parish minister and other good Christians to gather at the Shaw's house each week, where they would fast and pray. The church elders didn't stop at praying though. They compiled a report on the case and then sought permission from the King's Privy Council to start a formal investigation. Permission was granted and a commission was set up to try the witches. Now, this commission was made up of the who's who of Renfrewshire, and it was headed up by Alexander Stewart, who, surprise surprise, was a relation of the Shaw family. Next, Christian's parents called for Agnes Naismith to come and witness the torment that she was causing their daughter, maybe hoping that it would appeal to her conscience. She was brought up to Christian's room and, of her own accord, she began to pray for Christian, that the Lord of heaven and earth might send the damsel her health. From then on, when Agnes appeared before Christian in spectral form, it was no longer to torment her, but to try and defend her from the rest of the witches' attacks. Seeing how successful this approach was, Catherine Campbell was called to visit Christian. This didn't go to plan though. When they asked Catherine to pray for their daughter, she refused. Instead, she cursed the whole family, and particularly Christian, and all that belonged to her. Not only that, but she then said, "Let the devil let her never grow better, or any concerned in her be in a better condition than she was in for what they had done to her." Absolutely enraged, John Shaw then persuaded the sheriff to take Catherine into custody. Catherine was searched, and in her pocket they found a ball of hair made up of hair of many different colours, just like the hair that Christian had been throwing up. The ball of hair was thrown onto the fire, and after this, no more hair ever came out of Christian's mouth. It was believed that once a witch was in prison, they couldn't harm their victims so severely, if at all. Christian's fits still continued though, at the hands of a growing number of tormentors. According to Christian, it would seem that practically everyone in Renfrewshire was a witch. Not the rich though, they were above that sort of thing. But any poor person that came to the door of the Shaw household was in danger of being accused. A beggar woman with a scabbed face, a Highland fellow seeking shelter, a farmer on John Shaw's land. All of these people were accused, and the list would continue to grow. Christian's fits got more and more theatrical. She screeched, she cried and leapt around the room. She sang, she cackled and ripped off items of clothing. She had such strength during these fits that 2 grown men couldn't restrain her. She then started to suffer from flying fits, where it was said that she was carried away with such a swift and unaccountable motion that it was not in the power of any to prevent her feet not touching the ground. Christian's tormentors often spoke to her, and they forbade her from telling anyone what was said. Whenever she tried to reveal their secrets, she would suffer terribly. She couldn't even pray for help. If she did, her eyes rolled into the back of her head, her teeth clenched shut, and her body became stiff and rigid. Then, after one of her fits, Christian had a revelation. There was a charm under her bed, and that was what was stopping her from speaking freely, stopping her from praying. The search for the charm then began, and to everyone's surprise, there was a single eggshell under her bed, open at one end.
Ooh, is this a bewitched eggshell?
It is indeed.
Genius! No one would suspect an eggshell. But, how do we know it wasn't just a normal eggshell?
Well, you see, when it was thrown into the fire, it melted away like wax without making a noise, which apparently eggshells don't usually do.
Oh, well, that settles it then.
Absolutely. With the charm destroyed, Christian was able to reveal some of the witch's secrets. She told everyone about how the witches wanted her to become a witch too. They promised her riches and perfect health in return, but Christian refused. They also wanted her consent to take the life of her new baby sister, but she also refused. In February 1697, the newly set up commission would start bringing in those accused by Christian for questioning. They arrested Alexander Anderson, described as an ignorant, irreligious fellow who had always been of evil fame, and his daughter, Elizabeth Anderson, who was only 17 years old. Elizabeth Anderson was questioned by the authorities and was absolutely adamant that she hadn't been involved in any witchcraft whatsoever. She changed her tune though, after being seriously importuned and dealt with in the prison by two gentlemen. Now, we don't know what they did to her, but it definitely doesn't sound very nice. The poor girl probably felt forced to confess to something, anything to save herself. She went on to tell the authorities that she'd been introduced to the devil by her grandmother. He appeared as a black, grim man whose hands were cold to the touch. She confessed that she and her father attended meetings with both the devil and the witches that tormented Christian. But she made it clear that she had never renounced her baptism and she'd never given herself over to the devil. She then began to reel off the names of these witches. Many of them were members of her own family, including her father, her two young cousins, and her grandaunt. There were names that Christian had stated too. Elizabeth would then reveal that the witches were getting up to a lot more than just tormenting Christian. They had killed a minister called John Hardy, an elderly man that was highly regarded in the community. As he was dying, he could hear voices, saw doors opening of their own accord, and he could see his tormentors all around him, the witches. Elizabeth explained that the witches had created an effigy of the minister, doused it in alcohol, set it on fire, and stuck pins in it. This is what killed the minister. Next, the witches gathered with the devil near the ferry boat of Erskine. Their plan was to overturn the boat, but some of the witches, they didn't want to. You see, they were friends with the ferryman. But the ferryman's mother-in-law was among the witches, and she wanted him dead. Why? Because he had expelled her out of his house a little while before the meeting. So they carried on with their diabolical plan, using their powers to overturn the boat, and in the process drowning the ferryman and the laird of Brighouse. Finally, there were some children that died mysteriously, and Elizabeth pinned these deaths on the witches too. Now, it wasn't just Elizabeth spouting these claims. Oh no, there would be 5 confessants, as they were called, in total. There were her 2 young cousins that she'd so lovingly dobbed in to the authorities, Thomas Lindsay, 12, and James Lindsay, 14. They both would tell the same story. Then 2 sisters that were among the accused, Janet Roger and Margaret Roger, would pile in too, confessing to being at the witches' meetings and witnessing the same events. Interestingly, the 2 sisters weren't young, they were around middle age. Word soon got round to Margaret Lang, a middle-aged woman who worked as a midwife, that Elizabeth Anderson had accused her and her daughter of bewitching Christian. This was devastating news. The two needed to prove their innocence, and quickly. Before they were apprehended, they rushed off to John Shaw's house to confront Christian. They went up to her room and they asked her if they had been among the witches that tormented her. Christian said that she'd seen her daughter many times, but not Margaret. When the two women left the room, Christian suffered a terrible fit, and she tried to tell all of those around her that Margaret had indeed been one of the tormentors. Margaret heard all of the commotion and began to pray for Christian, hoping to prove her innocence. But it didn't work. Christian said that her tongue was now loose and she could freely accuse Margaret. What's more, a voice had told Christian that Margaret had deviously left a charm, a parcel of hair in the hallway, and that was what had prevented her from accusing Margaret to her face. The search for the charm began, and lo and behold, a parcel of hair was found. Margaret was then arrested. In the end, a total of 35 people would be accused of witchcraft. All those suspected were made to carry out an absolutely foolproof, absolutely infallible touch test. That is, if their touch caused Christian to have a fit, this was seen as evidence of guilt.
Wow, they love this test, don't they?
I know, we saw it in the Isle of Magee Witches case too, but at least in that one they had a few more tests and a few weak controls in place. Next was the test for the devil's or witch's mark, a mark that would not feel pain or bleed. It was thought that witches got these marks from being touched, kissed or bitten by the devil. It was evidence of a pact with him that you'd renounce your baptism and declare the devil as your lord. This test would have been a truly awful, painful experience. The accused would be stripped down and sometimes even shaved because the mark could be hiding behind their lovely locks. They would then be poked and prodded with a needle that was several inches long. The 35 were reduced down to 9, but only 7 would make it to trial. Alexander Anderson, the father of Elizabeth Anderson, who was one of the confessants, well, he sadly died in jail before the trial, and John Reed, who was to be tried at a later date, was found hanging in his jail cell. The trial would take place in a courthouse in Paisley. Evidence was given by many, including the church ministers, Christian's parents, Dr. Brisbane, and the confessants mentioned earlier. James Robertson, the advocate for the 7 accused, tried to argue that there was a natural cause for the events, that for a conviction to be made, natural causation had to be ruled out. He put forward quite a convincing case, but many of the accused were already not well liked in the community, and the jury had been threatened by the prosecutor. The prosecutor said that if the jury acquitted the accused, then they would be accessory to all their crimes.
What?
I know, it's terrible, isn't it? During the trial, the devil would appear to Christian one last time, in the shape of a naked man with a shirt, having much hair upon his hands and his face like swine's whistles. Christian resisted his temptations, and on the 28th of March, she woke up, a brand new girl, completely and utterly recovered. The trial would last from mid-March to mid-May, and in the end, all 7 of the accused were found guilty and sentenced to death. All 5 of the confessants managed to escape execution. On the 10th of June, 1697, the 7 convicted witches were taken to the Gala Green of Paisley, where huge crowds of people had gathered, eager to witness the spectacle. Each victim was brought to the scaffold and hanged. Poor Margaret Fulton was said to have lost all reason by the time she had reached the noose. Margaret Lang went calmly in prayer. Some say that the adult Lindsay brothers were discussing confessing, and Lindsay and Barlock either gave a muted speech or went quietly. Catherine Campbell, on the other hand, had to be dragged to the scaffold kicking and screaming, and then, in true badass fashion, she called down the wrath of God and the devil on her accusers. Agnes Naismith also put up one hell of a fight, struggling up until the very end. With her dying breath, she cursed everyone present and their descendants. Once each of the 7 were hanged, they were cut down and their bodies placed in a raging fire. They were quickly consumed by the flames. And what about Christian? Well, she would go on to live a very successful life, turning out to be quite the shrewd businesswoman. after a sneaky little bit of industrial espionage in Holland, she used the knowledge she obtained to found the Renfrewshire thread industry. So what really happened here? Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think that any of these men or women were witches. They were people on the margins of society that didn't fit the mould and didn't behave how society expected them to. Many of them had already built up a poor reputation in the community, so they didn't stand a chance against the accusations of Christian, who was the daughter of a laird no less. Even the language used to describe the accused is completely different to that used for Christian. The accused were proud, revengeful, malicious, ignorant and irreligious, whereas Christian was smart, lively and of good inclinations. It was a time of high stress in Scotland, with famine, the threat of an invasion and widespread poverty. This is when witch hunts thrive. Everyone's on edge and everyone needs someone to blame for their misfortunes. And what about the confessants? Why would those 5 confess to the things that they did? Well, the interrogation they went through would have been brutal. They would have likely been sleep deprived, which is a form of torture, and the stakes were high. They probably hoped that repenting and confessing, basically telling the interrogators what they wanted to hear, would save them from the death penalty, and in the end, it did. And what about Christian's fits? Well, it's possible that a medical condition was causing her symptoms, such as epilepsy for the seizures and pica for the vomiting of strange objects. Pica is a disorder where people compulsively eat things that really shouldn't be eaten. Some have suggested that she was suffering from a conversion disorder, where stress and anxiety are converted into physical symptoms. Now, she was likely fearful of Catherine Campbell. Catherine had screamed a curse at her 3 times no less. She was also probably worried about the fact that she snapped at Agnes Naismith, a scary old lady that everyone already thought was a witch. Some have even suggested that she was faking it to get attention and that it all just got a bit out of hand. This whole witchcraft ordeal allowed her to become the star of the show, at a time when she might have felt pushed to the sidelines. Remember, the Shaws had had a new addition to the family. Her baby sister had just recently been born. Witchcraft cases were well documented and publicised, so she'd know exactly what to do to make the ruse believable. Interestingly, in 1839, the Shaws' deserted house became quite the tourist attraction. Christian's room remained untouched. Her bed was still there. There was still a tapestry on the wall, and behind her bed was apparently a small hole in the wall. Some believe that through this hole she could have worked with an accomplice. Now, this was found over 100 years later though, so who knows if it was there at the time of the witch hunt. Whatever the case, the sad reality is that 9 people lost their lives in a witch hunt that was sparked by the accusations of a child and carried out by a community that failed them. The ashes of the 7 victims lie underneath a busy junction, the Maxwelton Cross in Paisley. A crossroad was chosen to confuse their spirits so that they would remain trapped forever, and the dying curses of Catherine and Agnes were dealt with by setting a horseshoe into the road. But this mysteriously went missing in the 1970s. Today, an unassuming memorial plaque marks the spot, with a new horseshoe and the inscription, "Pain inflicted, suffering endured, injustice done." Make sure to check out this video on the Island of McGee Witches. I bet you've never heard of them. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, make sure to check under your bed for bewitched eggshells, and I hope you have a magnificent day.